most people, the scriptures are experienced like a box of puzzle pieces. We reach into the box and pull out a story. We study it, we ponder it, we work to determine its meaning and significance and how it applies to our lives, and then we put it back in the box. The next day we repeat the process and continue to do so over and over again. But since we don't put the pieces together, we never get to see the full picture. Scripture is a powerful thing, and much can be gained through this process, isolating specific passages to glean the truths contained in any given story. But there is another level of truth communicated through Scripture that can only be grasped when we know the entire story of the Bible, called the meta-narrative. God has much to communicate to us as we learn how He works out His will through the chronological events of the Bible. This is the focus of this course. And by the time it's over, you will have a basic understanding of the big picture of God's plan for the world and how it was worked out, beginning with an unlikely group of Egyptian slaves. God made quite the promise to Abram. He would bless him, He would make his name great, and He would make him into a great nation. Now, to be a nation, you must have land, so God promised Abram the land that would eventually become what we know as the nation of Israel. One of the goals of this seminar is to help you understand the importance of this piece of land and the role it plays in the story of Israel. In many ways, the land functions like a third character in the story. It's the story of a nation, their God named Yahweh, and the land that He gave them. The significance of this land cannot be overstated. Now, Genesis tells us that this land wasn't just sitting around vacant, waiting for Abram's descendants to claim it. The promised land was occupied by the Canaanites. In fact, archaeologists tell us that the Canaanites had been on the land a minimum of 1,000 years before Abram, and likely long before that. You know, it always seemed a little bit unfair to me that God gave the Israelites someone else's land. And it's not like He told them to go settle in the promised land and live peacefully with the Canaanites. No. He told them to go to the land, take it by force, and kill all of its inhabitants. Was this really necessary? Let's look into the issue, beginning with the Canaanite religion, Baal worship. The Canaanite religion. When the Israelites invaded the promised land, they were supposed to settle in their allotted territories and finish the job that had been started. The larger tribes helping the smaller ones clear the land of their enemies. This was no small task, because not only did they have to battle the Canaanites, they also had to fight the mighty Philistines who had settled on the southern coastal region of the Promised Land. Well, instead of sticking to the task until the job was done, the whole invasion just fizzled out. They did not rid the land of the Canaanites, which means they did not rid the land of Baal worship. The Israelites would pay for this failure for hundreds of years. Let's read from Judges 2 to see how it all played out. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the first three kings of Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon. As I explained earlier, the purpose of this seminar is to fill in the missing pieces of the narrative. And most people have already spent quite a bit of time learning about these three characters who are so central to the story of Israel. But what I am going to do is to make some general observations that should help put the pieces of the larger story together. Beginning with Saul. What was life like for Israel's first king? The Philistines put a lot of pressure on the young monarchy. They monopolized the metal industry, so they had superior weapons. They had chariots, and they used them wherever the terrain permitted. And the Philistines had a superior army that was highly trained and had been tested in battle for generations. Remember, the Philistines had battled the Egyptian army earlier and very nearly defeated them. When Saul inherited his fighting force, it was an untrained army of volunteers. Yet the scriptures make it clear that none of these things were a concern. For God had knowingly given them land that had formidable enemies both inside and outside of its borders. The Israelites had only been able to take the land and hold on to it because of God's miraculous intervention. Every aspect of Israel's success was God's doing and not their own. And remember, Saul wasn't alone in this. Samuel, God's chosen prophet, was standing right beside Saul, interpreting events and providing guidance. Ultimately, if Saul had honored God and submitted to his authority, things would have gone completely differently for him. Sadly, if you are familiar with the story, you know that Saul failed to do this, and as a result, he failed miserably in his role as king. By the time of Jeroboam II, the religious practices of Israel were in moral chaos. As king of Israel, Jeroboam's job was to be the guardian of the faith. But like his namesake before him, he allowed pagan rites and rituals to become mingled in with the worship of Yahweh. Let me describe to you how bad things had become. The Israelites thanked Baal, not Yahweh, for the spring crops. They practiced discerning the future by magic. And just like the Canaanites, the Israelites wailed and gashed themselves to gain answers to their prayers. During the religious festivals, the holiest of all Jewish days, criminal outbursts were commonplace. Even worse, drunkenness and sexual immorality were woven into the sacred worship ceremonies. The people were so confused by this fusion of Canaanite and Jewish religious practices that they believed their behavior would actually lead to blessing and prosperity. The Israelites had strayed so far that they had lost all sense of the nature and character of their God and what it meant to be his people. Add to this apostasy the social justice issues that we discussed earlier, and what emerges is a grim picture of religious failure. Amos, who was the prophet at the time, saw grounds for full-scale judgment. Israel's days were numbered. After the Babylonians defeated Judah and burned Jerusalem and Solomon's temple to the ground, the vast majority of the population of the hill country of Judah who had survived the attack were marched off to Babylon. Though one would expect the story to tell us that the Judites were enslaved and brutalized in Babylon, this is actually not what happened. Life in Babylon was actually quite good for the Judites. In Babylon, the Jews were free to worship their God and perform religious practices like observing the Sabbath and circumcision. They had homes and they had gardens. They raised their families and they ran their own businesses, some of which were actually quite successful. So when the remarkable opportunity came for the Judites to return to their homeland, back in the hill country of Judah, many of the exiles were not too enthusiastic about the idea. The hill country had been utterly destroyed by the Babylonians a half-century earlier. It was a wasteland of broken down, burned out buildings and overgrown fields. We're going to step back into our story now to talk about one of the more colorful characters in Israel's history. Not long after the Romans invaded Jerusalem, the Roman government entered into a turbulent time. In the midst of the political upheaval, a leader arose in Judea named Herod the Great. You may be wondering why we would give Herod any time at all when he only makes a brief appearance in the book of Matthew as the mastermind behind the grisly murder of the male infants in Bethlehem. While he was not a major player in the writings of the New Testament, he did make a profound mark on the land, the local economy, and Jewish worship practices, most significantly by building the Jews a world-class temple in Jerusalem. This new temple was between 4 and 5 times larger than its predecessor. In fact, it was the largest temple complex in the ancient world, 5 times larger than the Parthenon. and it put Jerusalem on the international stage. Let's look at a modern-day recreation so we can have a sense of its scope and its greatness. With the destruction of Herod's temple in 70 AD, the Jewish faith was forced to change. The temple had been the center of Jewish life, and now it was gone. Remember, no temple meant there could be no more sacrifices. The offering system that had continued daily for over 550 years had come to its ultimate end. Well, instead of abandoning their faith completely, the Jewish community opted to make a radical shift in the practice of their faith. They recentered themselves around the synagogue and decided to substitute the blood sacrifices. Every year there were more and more Christians coming out of the Gentile world and less from the Jews. Christianity was gradually becoming a Gentile faith. Let's read Paul's summary of the Gentile story as it's recorded in Ephesians 2:11 through 22. And now that you've walked through the entire story from beginning to end, this passage will resonate with new meaning and significance for you. Don't forget that you Gentiles used to be outsiders. You were called uncircumcised heathens by the Jews, who were proud of their circumcision, even though it affected only their bodies